Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going deep, really deep, into something that I think has been on a lot of people's minds.
Yeah, definitely.
And that's this whole potential for war escalation between the U.S. and Russia.
Big one.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we all want to try to understand this without getting totally overwhelmed by all the information out there.
Sure.
And we've actually got some pretty diverse sources that we're going to look at today to try to untangle all this.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so we've got some academic texts on nation building.
Okay.
We've got analyses of nuclear strategy,
Interesting.
and we even have a study on financial literacy in the U.S.
What? Really?
Yeah. So you
Yeah.
might be thinking, wait, what does financial literacy have to do with war?
Yeah. How does that fit in?
Yeah, it's kind of a head scratcher at first,
Yeah.
but trust me, it'll all become clear as we go along.
All right. I'm intrigued.
All right, so why don't we just jump right in?
Let's do it.
First up, we're going to explore this whole idea of the fragility of empires,
Well, I like that.
especially those empires that were built on sort of a patchwork of different languages and ethnic groups.
Right.
And our guide for this is going to be Andreas Wimmer's work on nation building.
All right. So Wimmer's research, it shows just how difficult it is to try to forge a unified national identity
Yeah.
when you've got all this diversity.
Mm-hmm.
He uses the Romanov and Soviet empires as like prime examples of this.
Oh, interesting.
Imagine trying to create like a shared sense of belonging in a place where you've got dozens of languages being spoken,
Oh.
from Finnish to Korean to Turkish and Romanian. It's a lot.
Yeah, that's a recipe for instability for sure.
It really is. It's like trying to build a house out of mismatched bricks.
Yeah.
You might be able to get it to stand for a while, but it's not going to be very stable.
No, not at all.
And then you have to think about how these internal divisions can really affect a nation's decisions when it comes to foreign policy.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, if you're a leader and you're dealing with all this instability at home, one way to distract from that or even rally support is to try to project strength on the world stage. Make it look like you're tough.
So you're saying that Russia's internal problems, like the stuff that Wimmer talks about, could actually be contributing to the current tensions with the U.S.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a factor.
What's
It's
that?
a piece of the puzzle,
So we've got this history of instability in Russia, and then we have to layer on top of that this concept of asymmetric escalation.
Ooh, that sounds intense.
Yeah. And this comes from our next source, Nuclear Strategy in the Modern Era by Vipin Narang.
Okay.
So this asymmetric escalation, it's like a nuclear posture.
Mm-hmm.
And it's usually adopted by countries that are facing, a conventionally superior adversary.
Right. So if you're up against someone with a much bigger, more powerful military.
Exactly. It's their way of leveling the playing field.
So they threaten to use nukes if things escalate too far.
Exactly. It's kind of like, David versus Goliath,
Yeah.
but with incredibly high stakes.
Like life-ending stakes.
Yeah.
And the example that Narang uses in his book, which is kind of a classic one, is Pakistan's nuclear strategy.
Oh, okay.
They're facing India, which is much larger and conventionally stronger.
Right.
And Pakistan's whole nuclear doctrine is built around this idea that they might have to use nuclear weapons early in a conflict to stop India from attacking them.
Okay. So, that makes sense in that context.
Yeah.
But if we apply this, to the U.S. and Russia, does that mean that Russia views the U.S. as this conventionally superior adversary?
Mm-hmm.
And could that be influencing their whole nuclear posture?
That's the million-dollar question. If Russia sees itself as being at a disadvantage, in terms of conventional military power,
Yeah.
it could make this idea of asymmetric escalation much more appealing.
And that's a chilling thought. I think
Yeah.
a lot of times when people think about nuclear weapons, they think about, deterring existential threats,
Right.
like preventing an all-out nuclear war.
Mutually assured destruction, the big one.
Right, exactly.
But what Narang's research is saying is that nukes can also influence these smaller conventional conflicts.
Whoa.
So it's not just about preventing total annihilation.
Got it.
It's more complicated than that. Different nuclear postures can actually have different deterrent effects, even if we're talking about conflicts where nuclear weapons aren't actually being used.
Okay, so give me an example of that. I need something concrete here to wrap my head around this.
Okay, so let's look at the 1990 Kashmir crisis between India and Pakistan. Now, at that point, both countries had nuclear capabilities,
Right.
but they hadn't officially declared themselves as nuclear-armed states.
Got it. So there was that ambiguity.
Exactly. And even with that ambiguity, Pakistan's implicit nuclear threat probably stopped India from escalating the conflict.
Interesting. So even the potential for nuclear escalation had a real impact.
Oh, absolutely.
Wow.
Because that potential, it weighs heavily on the minds of leaders,
Yeah, that makes sense.
even when nuclear weapons aren't, explicitly part of the conversation.
Okay, that makes sense. What about, a situation where both countries are openly nuclear armed?
Yeah, so for that, we can look at the standoff between India and Pakistan in 2001, 2002.
Okay, right after the terrorist attack on the Indian parliament.
Exactly. Tensions were super high. Both countries mobilized their forces. The whole world was watching, worried about what might happen.
Oh, I remember that.
And again, the possibility of a nuclear exchange, it acted as a deterrent and ultimately helped to de-escalate the situation.
So these historical examples, they really show that nuclear deterrence is about a lot more than just, mutually assured destruction.
Right. It's not just about if you nuke me, I'll nuke you back.
Yeah.
It's much more nuanced than that.
Okay, so we've got nation building, we've got nuclear strategy. Now let's bring in some history.
Sure.
Both Clausewitz in On War and Lawrence Friedman in Strategy.
Two heavy hitters?
Yeah, absolutely. They both emphasize how much historical precedent really shapes a nation's strategic thinking.
Clausewitz, who was, brilliant military theorist, he said that a country's experiences throughout history,
Yeah.
they really influence how that country sees its own security
Okay.
and how it views its rivals, like
Yeah.
what it thinks their intentions are.
It's almost like a nation's strategic DNA is encoded with memories. Memories of past victories and defeats and even betrayals.
Right, like the scars of history.
Yeah.
And a perfect example of that is the Cold War.
Yeah.
That rivalry between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, it went on for decades. It shaped how entire generations saw the world.
For sure.
And even though the Cold War officially ended, like back in 91,
Yeah.
the legacy of it, it's still shaping how the U.S. and Russia interact today.
So we're still grappling with the ghosts of conflicts past.
In a way, yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. So history provides like a framework
Yes.
for understanding what's going on in the world right now.
And for trying to anticipate what might happen next.
Yeah, okay.
That's why events like the Cuban Missile Crisis
Oh, wow, yeah.
or the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, they're still relevant.
Right.
Even today when we're trying to analyze U.S.-Russia relations.
So each nation has a mental map
Yeah, I like that.
of its own history
Yeah.
that it's using to navigate the present.
Exactly. But the thing is, those maps, they're not always accurate and they're not always objective.
Oh, okay.
Perceptions of history can be just as powerful as actual events. What people believe happened can be just as influential as what actually happened.
Wow.
And that's especially true when we're talking about, potential for conflict
Right.
between countries like the U.S. and Russia.
So how does this idea of historical baggage, how does it actually play out, given the current tensions?
Well, both sides are viewing each other's actions through the lens of their own experiences.
Right.
So the U.S., they often see Russia's more assertive foreign policy as like a return to, Cold War style aggression. And Russia, they see NATO expansion as, a betrayal of promises that were made after the Cold War ended.
Oh, okay. So it's like a recipe for misunderstanding.
And mistrust, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so important to try to understand this historical context. We have to acknowledge that the past matters, but
Yeah.
we also need to recognize that that we don't have to keep repeating the same mistakes.
Yeah, we can learn from them, hopefully.
Exactly.
Okay, now, are you ready for the surprise connection to financial literacy?
I'm ready. Lay it on me.
Okay. All right. So this might seem like a total left turn,
Okay.
but bear with me.
All right.
So the National Financial Literacy Strategy, it talks about how important economic strength is
Okay.
and the ability to mobilize resources
Makes sense.
for any nation,
Mm-hmm.
but especially in the context of a potential conflict.
So it's not just about troops and weapons.
Right. Exactly.
It's about a country's economic backbone, too.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
A nation's ability to sustain military operations over time, I mean, it really depends on its economic foundation.
It's a marathon, not a sprint.
Yeah, perfect analogy.
Think about the difference between the U.S. and Russia economically. I mean, the U.S. has this much larger, much more diverse economy.
Right.
That's a huge advantage,
Mm-hmm.
especially if you're talking about a long conflict.
Right, a war of attrition.
Exactly.
So are you saying that economic strength could actually deter Russia from escalating tensions with the U.S.?
I think it's definitely a factor.
Okay.
Because a country's economic situation, I mean, that can really influence its decision-making process.
Yeah.
Especially if they're thinking about picking a fight with someone who's much stronger economically.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So Russia's, economic vulnerability could make them more cautious.
Possibly, yeah.
Wow, this is adding a whole new layer to how we're thinking about this potential for escalation.
And it shows how important it is to think outside the box.
Yeah.
You beyond just the traditional military factors, because economic strength or the lack of it, that can be a really powerful driver. When it comes to making strategic decisions, it's interesting to think about how a nation's internal struggles, like the things Wimmer talks about, how that can actually fuel this desire for outward expansion.
Oh, almost like a distraction tactic.
Yeah, yeah.
A way to unify a fractured country
Yeah.
Against a common enemy.
Exactly. And that, that kind of brings us back to Russia.
Right.
And its historical experience. I mean, throughout its history, it's faced all these invasions and threats from its western borders.
Yeah, I mean, Napoleon's invasion in 1812 comes to mind.
Oh, for sure.
Clausewitz actually dedicates a good chunk of On War to analyzing that whole campaign.
Yeah, and that experience, along with the devastation of World War II, I mean, those things left, a deep scar on Russia's collective psyche.
Right, it's like this profound sense of vulnerability.
Yeah, exactly.
That continues to shape its strategic thinking today. So when Russia looks westward, it's not just seeing, potential rivals.
Right.
It's seeing echoes of these past invasions and betrayals.
Exactly. And, that perception, that feeling of being vulnerable, it can lead to a more assertive and more defensive foreign policy.
Right, almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, you know?
The more Russia worries about being encircled and threatened by the West,
Yeah.
the more aggressively it acts.
Right.
And that, of course, just reinforces those same fears in the West.
Yeah, it's this vicious cycle.
It really is. And it's, it's been tough to break.
Yeah.
And then you throw nuclear weapons into the mix, and the stakes get even higher.
Right. Speaking of nuclear weapons, I want to kind of circle back to this concept of asymmetric escalation for a sec.
Okay.
It seems, I don't know, it seems kind of risky.
It is.
Almost like a cornered animal lashing out.
Yeah, there's definitely a sense of desperation to it. But for a country like Pakistan, facing a much stronger opponent like India,
Right.
they see it as a necessary deterrent.
Okay.
It's about, establishing a credible threat. That raises the costs of aggression to an unacceptable level.
Right, right. But wouldn't using nuclear weapons, even on a limited scale, I mean, wouldn't that risk catastrophic consequences?
Of course. I mean, that's why asymmetric escalation is it's a last resort.
Yeah.
The goal is to make the threat so credible, so terrifying that you never actually have to use it.
It's a very delicate and dangerous balancing act.
It is, and it really highlights how important clear communication is and understanding between nuclear armed countries.
Right, because miscalculations.
Yeah.
And misinterpretations.
They can have devastating consequences.
Yeah, absolutely.
So in a way, it's as much about psychology as it is about military capabilities.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
So deterrence, especially in the nuclear age, it's about influencing perceptions.
Yes.
And shaping behavior. It's just as much as it is about, raw firepower.
Right. It's a mind game as much as anything else.
Okay. I want to touch on something that's been kind of nagging at me.
Sure.
We've been talking about the role of history and strategic thinking. But what about the role of individual leaders.
Oh, interesting.
Do personalities matter in all of this?
Oh, they definitely do.
Okay.
I mean, leaders, they bring their own biases, their own experiences, their own worldviews to the table.
Yeah.
And those personal factors, they can have a huge impact on how a country, approaches its foreign policy.
So a hawkish leader, for example, might be more likely to escalate a conflict,
Yeah.
while a more dovish leader might favor diplomacy.
Yeah, that's a simplification, but you're on the right track. I mean, a leader's personality, their decision-making style, it can really influence how a country responds in a crisis.
Yeah, I mean, think about Putin, for example.
Yeah.
His background in the KGB and his assertive leadership style.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, those things they've undoubtedly shaped Russia's foreign policy in recent years.
Oh, for sure. And then, on the American side, you've had presidents with very different approaches to dealing with Russia,
Mm-hmm.
from George H.W. Bush's cautious engagement to Barack Obama's reset attempt to Donald Trump's more confrontational stance.
Yeah.
Each one brought their own unique perspective.
It makes you wonder how different the world might look if different people had been in charge during these pivotal moments in history.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thought experiment.
It is.
I mean, the role of individuals in shaping the course of history, that's something that historians and political scientists they still debate.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
This conversation has been so illuminating.
Yeah, it has.
It feels like we've really peeled back the layers of history and strategy and psychology to understand how U.S.-Russia relations really work.
But we have to remember, this is a dynamic relationship. It's constantly changing.
Mm-hmm.
So what's true today might not be true tomorrow.
Yeah, that's a good point, which is why it's so important to stay informed and to challenge our own assumptions.
Yes.
And to look for different perspectives.
Absolutely. And never underestimate the power of critical thinking. With so much information out there, it's more important than ever to be able to sift through the noise.
Yeah.
And figure out what's real and what's not.
Speaking of discerning fact from fiction, let's turn our attention to this element of financial literacy.
Oh, yes.
Which is often overlooked, but it's so important.
The economic underpinnings of power and conflict, this is where things get really interesting.
Okay, I'm all ears.
All right. So imagine a country that's getting ready for a big military campaign.
Okay.
They need to mobilize all these resources, troops, weapons, fuel, food.
It's a logistical nightmare.
Exactly. And to keep that war effort going, you need a really strong economy.
Yeah.
And this is where financial literacy comes in.
I'm still not quite seeing the connection.
Okay, so think about it this way. A country where the people understand basic financial concepts, they're better equipped to manage their resources, to make good economic decisions, and to weather those inevitable shocks that come with conflict.
So it's not just about individuals balancing their checkbooks. It's about a nation's overall economic health.
Exactly.
And resilience.
Yes, and that has a huge impact on a country's ability to project power on the world stage.
So a nation with a strong economic foundation, they're better positioned to be in a long conflict.
Yeah.
Whereas a nation with a weaker economy might be more cautious.
Exactly, because economic strength can be a deterrent.
It's like its own weapon.
It is. It gives a nation the capacity to deal with economic sanctions, to fund its military, to support its allies.
Wow. This is making me rethink my whole understanding of power dynamics.
Well, that's good. It's important to challenge our assumptions, to broaden our perspectives.
Okay, so let's apply this to the U.S. and Russia.
Sure.
We already talked about the vast economic difference between the two countries.
Yeah, and the U.S. clearly has the economic upper hand there, but it's not just about the size of the economy.
Oh, okay.
It's also about how financially literate the population is.
So are we saying that Russia's economic vulnerabilities could actually make them more hesitant to escalate tensions with the U.S.?
It's definitely something to think about. I mean, Russia's economy, it's heavily dependent on energy exports,
Right.
which means they're very vulnerable to price fluctuations and sanctions.
Yeah.
And then, they've got this history of corruption and cronyism,
Right.
which hasn't exactly created a culture of financial transparency and accountability.
Yeah, and those underlying weaknesses, I mean, they could limit Russia's ability to be in a long conflict.
Especially against someone, with a stronger economy.
Right. This is such a mind-blowing insight.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it?
It is.
I mean, we tend to focus on the military and geopolitical aspects of conflict, but the economic dimension, it's just as important.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's often overlooked or underestimated.
Right.
But in today's world, where everything is so interconnected, economic warfare can be just as damaging as traditional military force.
This has given me so much to think about.
Good.
It seems like every source we've looked at has just revealed another layer of complexity in this whole U.S.-Russia relationship.
And that's the beauty of a deep dive like this.
Yeah.
It's about uncovering the hidden connections and the forces that that shape our world.
Okay, ready for another thought-provoking question to ponder?
I'm always ready.
Okay, so our deep dive today has, it's focused a lot on the role of the state and its strategic calculations.
Right.
But what about the role of the people?
Oh, interesting.
How do the hopes and fears and aspirations of, everyday citizens in both the U.S. and Russia?
Yeah.
How do those things influence the potential for escalation or de-escalation between these two nuclear superpowers?
That's a great question.
It reminds us that international relations aren't just about abstract geopolitical maneuvering.
Right.
It's about real people with real lives.
Yes.
Hopes and dreams.
And sometimes those hopes and dreams they clash with the ambitions of those in power.
Yeah, it's a tension that's played out throughout history.
It has.
And it's still shaping our world today.
For sure.
This has been such an incredible journey.
It has.
And I feel like we've only just begun to explore the depths of this relationship between the U.S. and Russia.
And that's the key takeaway, right?
Yeah.
There's always more to learn, more perspectives to consider, more connections to uncover.
Speaking of uncovering, we have one final source to look at today.
Oh, good.
One that might surprise you.
All right. I love a good twist.
So our final source, World History for International Studies, it takes us back to the early modern period.
Okay.
To the writings of Niccolo Machiavelli.
Oh, Machiavelli, huh?
Yeah.
The master of political realism.
Yeah, yeah.
What can you tell us about about the rivalry between the U.S. and Russia today?
Well, Machiavelli was he was fascinated by this interplay of power and morality.
Okay.
And perception in international relations.
Right. And he argued that that leaders should do what's best for their state, even if it means bending the rules a little bit.
Yeah, even if it means breaking the rules.
Yeah.
It's definitely a controversial philosophy.
It is.
But one that's been pretty influential throughout history.
For sure.
And when we look at the current tensions between the U.S. and Russia, I mean, we could see echoes of Machiavelli's ideas.
Oh, how so?
Well, both countries are pursuing their own, national interests, even if that means, taking actions that other countries might see as morally questionable.
Yeah, like, for example, the U.S. interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Right.
Or, Russia's annexation of Crimea.
Yeah.
And its support for separatists in eastern Ukraine.
Right. These are all things that have been condemned by the international community.
Yeah.
But the leaders of those countries, they saw those actions as necessary.
To achieve their own strategic goals.
Exactly, yeah.
So even though, Machiavelli was writing centuries ago, his ideas are still relevant today.
Yeah, the pursuit of power and national interest.
Those are still driving forces in, international relations.
Yeah.
And understanding Machiavelli's insights can help us to better navigate this complex world.
It's amazing how this whole conversation about, empires and nation building, it connects to what we're seeing in the world today.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, when we think about Wimmer's examples of the Romanov and Soviet empires collapsing, and it was partly along ethno-linguistic lines.
Right, those divisions.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It makes you think about any nation that hasn't really fully integrated its diverse population.
Mm-hmm. How stable can they really be?
Exactly.
In the long run.
And if we look at Russia today, I mean, with its vast territory and mix of ethnicities and languages,
Mm-hmm.
it makes you wonder how those internal dynamics might be influencing its foreign policy decisions.
It's like they're trying to juggle too many things at once.
Yeah.
If a country is constantly worried about internal divisions and potential unrest,
Right.
it's hard to focus on those external challenges.
Right. You can't have you can't have your eye on everything at the same time.
Exactly.
And that's where things can get really dangerous.
Yeah.
If a leader feels threatened both from within and outside, it's almost natural to try to find an external enemy to blame for the country's problems.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It's a way to unify the country,
Mm-hmm.
but it also creates a scapegoat.
It's a tactic as old as time.
Yeah.
I mean, and in the context of U.S.-Russia relations, it's something we have to be really careful about. I mean, both countries have a history of demonizing the other,
right?
Portraying them as the ultimate threat.
Yeah, and that kind of rhetoric, it's so dangerous.
It is.
Because it creates this atmosphere of fear and mistrust.
Exactly. And then it makes it much harder to to find common ground.
Yeah.
And to de-escalate tensions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Which is why it's so important to promote dialogue and understanding and even empathy.
Oh, yeah.
Between the U.S. and Russia.
Yeah.
We need to remember that we're not dealing with, these monolithic entities.
Right.
But with complex societies, with a wide range of viewpoints and perspectives.
We have to humanize the other and remind ourselves that we're all part of, the same human family.
Even if we have different, political systems or ideologies.
Exactly.
And that brings us back to something we talked about earlier.
Okay.
The role of individual leaders and how much of an impact they can have on a nation's foreign policy.
For sure.
We talked about, how leaders bring their own biases and experiences to the table.
Yeah.
But I think it's worth kind of digging a little deeper into leadership styles.
Okay.
How can different approaches to leadership really influence the potential for escalation or de-escalation?
It's a great question. I mean, we can think about leadership styles along a spectrum.
Yeah.
From those leaders who are more prone to confrontation and aggression,
right,
to those who favor diplomacy and compromise.
So on one end of the spectrum, you have the hawks, who see the world as this zero-sum game, and they're willing to use force, to get what they want.
And on the other end, you have the doves,
right,
who believe in dialogue and diplomacy.
Yeah, and are much more cautious about using military action.
It's
right. Of course, most leaders fall somewhere in between those two extremes.
Right.
But understanding those tendencies can be really helpful in trying to anticipate how a leader might react in a crisis.
For sure. Like, for instance, if a leader is known for being impulsive,
yeah,
or for not really caring about international norms,
yeah,
they might be more likely to escalate a conflict.
Okay.
But a leader who values multilateralism,
right,
and consultation, they're probably going to try to find a peaceful resolution.
Yeah, and we also have to consider the domestic political context.
Oh, absolutely.
A leader who's facing internal challenges or pressure from hawkish factions within their own government.
Right.
They might feel like they have to take a more aggressive stance. On the world stage.
Domestic politics, I mean, it can be a really powerful driver.
Yeah, yeah. This has been such an eye-opening deep dive.
It has been.
I feel like we've really gotten a much better understanding of all the factors that could that could lead to war between between the U.S. and Russia.
And it's so complex.
Yeah, incredibly complex. And it's important to remember that this isn't, a static situation. Things are constantly changing.
The relationship is evolving.
Yeah, and it's essential to, to stay informed.
To keep curious.
So what can our listener take away from all of this? How can they make sense of this complex and often really overwhelming issue?
I think the most important thing is to stay curious. Just keep learning.
Yeah.
Keep asking questions and keep challenging your own assumptions.
Yeah, don't be afraid to really dive into the history, the politics, the economics.
The psychology.
Yeah, even the psychology of this whole U.S.-Russia relationship.
And don't just rely on one perspective.
Yeah.
Seek out different viewpoints. Read widely.
Yeah, and have conversations with people who might have different opinions than your own.
Because the more we understand all these forces at play, the better we can advocate for peace and diplomacy, and a world free from from the threat of nuclear war.
Well said. I think that wraps up our deep dive for today.
It does.
Thank you so much for joining us on this journey.
Thanks for having me. It's been great.
Yeah, absolutely. Until next time, keep exploring.
Keep learning.